Okay, our album card is done now. It's just waiting for us to pass it some data. Before we get to that, let's just bang out this navbar element because it should be pretty easy. So I want to make this its own component. So I'll create a new component in a new file called navigation bar. I'll import React and Framer and then create my component function that returns a frame. I'll make my frame purple. I'll make it 96 points high, and I want it to span the full width of the screen, so I'll set the width to 100%. And I'll give it a slight drop shadow to help separate it from the rest of the screen. I'm also going to set the Z index in a style object. And I'm only doing this to prevent a rendering bug that happens in the preview window when we add the SVG later. So I don't quite understand what's causing the bug, so I can't explain why setting this Z index fixes it, but without this, our SVG will disappear when the preview window scales up. I'm making this frame with an opening and closing tag because I'm going to put some text inside it and I'm going to put a button inside it. So now if I go to my Components tab, I can drag this out onto my canvas so we can preview it as we build. Back in my code, I'll add a title for my app inside an h1 tag that goes inside my frame. That doesn't look so great, so I'll add a style property to the h1 tag and set a custom text style for this. So I'm setting the font size, weight, and color. And I want this text to be absolutely positioned. That will let me set its position based on its distance from the bottom and from the left. And then the last thing I need to do is get rid of the default margin value just by setting it to 0. So remember, these are CSS attributes that I'm using to style this text. I wrap them all in an object. And that's why I end up with these weird double braces. And the only modification I need to make from the normal CSS rule names are to change any properties that would normally have a dash to be camel cased. So font dash size becomes font size, font dash weight becomes font weight, etc. You could also do this styling with styled components, but that's probably overkill just to style a single line of text. Now all that's left to do is add the hamburger button that will bring up our settings panel. So I could use an image for that, or a design component like we did for the stars, but I'm going to use an SVG instead. This will be a pretty simple graphic, probably not something I'd normally need an SVG for, but I wanted to show at least one example of how that works in case you need it in the future. So I have a sketch file here with my hamburger icon drawn in it. And I can just select that icon, right-click, and choose Copy SVG Code to copy the SVG code for this icon. And then back in Framer, I can just paste that into my JSX. It's a bit of a mess, but if we look closely at this, it all looks pretty familiar, doesn't it? I see tag names with angle brackets. I see opening and closing tags. Some tags have other tags nested inside them. Some tags have properties defined within the tag itself. So it looks a lot like all the JSX that we've already been writing. Now I'm actually going to cut this out of my navigation bar component and put it in its own component so I don't add all this clutter to my main component. I don't anticipate using this icon anywhere else in my app, so I'm just going to add it to the same file here at the bottom. I'll create a new component function called hamburger icon, and my component will return a frame as its base element, and inside that frame I'll paste all this SVG code. So this component is giving me some errors because the SVG code that comes from Sketch has some stuff in it that we don't need in React. And luckily, we can just delete everything that's causing us problems. So the first thing to go is this first line of the SVG that defines what version of XML this is. We don't need it. I do need this SVG tag, but the only property that I need is viewBox. Everything else can go. The viewBox is sort of defining the area of the SVG that will get displayed, so we'll keep that in. And then there's 3 lines of metadata here that tells me that this came from Sketch and what its name was in the Sketch document. I don't need any of those. Now this is starting to look more manageable. When I save this, Framer reformats it to look a little bit wacky, but it's really just a few tags defining the visual properties of these 3 rectangle elements. And now I can add this hamburger icon component to my navigation bar. I don't need to import anything because this component is defined in the same file. Ugh, this is looking bad. So I deleted the parts of the SVG that define the width and the height, so my icon is scaling to fit this entire frame that I'm using for my base element. And the default size for a frame is 200 by 200, so I'm getting a giant hamburger icon, which is not what I want. It's a pretty easy fix. As we know, I can set the size of this frame. And I think doing it this way is actually better than having the size defined within the SVG, because if I spread the props into this frame, then I'll be able to control the size of the SVG icon by passing props to this hamburger icon component, just like I would with any other frame. So spreading these props also makes sure that any positioning coordinates I pass in will get applied, so I can set the right and bottom position of my icon. And now the last thing I have to do is just get rid of this default blue background for my outer frame. There we go. Pretty nice looking navbar, eh? Before we move on, I know I'm going to want to click on this hamburger button to open my settings panel. So I'm going to add a callback function to the onTap property of the hamburger icon tag. I don't have to write that function just yet, because I'm going to set it to whatever function gets passed in through props with the name onHamburgerTapped. So whenever my hamburger icon gets tapped, I'll call whatever function was passed in through my props object. And now I'm all set up to start using this navbar in my app. So we set up our navbar with a nice bold title, and we brought in some SVG code from Sketch for our icon. We cleaned it up a little bit and added a tap handler to turn it into a button that we'll use for our settings. Oops, I forgot to mention one thing we should have fixed in the SVG code we pasted in from Sketch here in my hamburger icon. Sometimes these property names in the SVG will contain a dash, like stroke-width or fill-rule right here. And just like when we're using CSS property names in React, we have to change those to be camel case. I forgot to mention this because our SVG was working just fine without changing these two, but you will run into situations where this type of thing will cause problems with your graphic, so don't forget that you need to change those.